this past June, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Award from PMTA. So congratulations once again for that. He runs the Dorothy Sutton State Level Festival. He's right now vice president of Mainline Music Teachers. He will be president next year. Jennifer has one more year to go. And let me see, he was program chair, and I recently took over from him for program chair. He's still my mentor on that. I still have to ask him a few questions once in a while. So one of his big things that his business is called mindfulness music, mindful music. And it's because he has taken to that subject over the past few years. In fact, even did a presentation for us on mindful music maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, somewhere like that. He's an intuitive man, and he puts his feelings and emotions into what he does and into his music. And so he called me up one day this summer and said, I think we should do something on concept preparation. And we were trying to get an actual presenter that's outside of Mainline to do that, but we couldn't come up with the one that we wanted. So he just made up his own presentation on his own, and he has, let me just say a couple more things here. He is a graduate of Yale University, where he got his bachelor's, and he's got his master's at the Eastman School of Music. Let me see, he's from the Philadelphia area. He has his own studio that he runs out of the Philadelphia area. And we also have here, let me see, serves as director of a cappella pops in Westchester. I didn't realize it was so close.
Yeah,
Westchester, okay, yeah. He's a certified meditation teacher, and he employs mindfulness techniques in his teaching and has presented mindfulness workshops for PMTA and as well as the national conference, the MTNA National Conference. Was that in Canada when you did that?
It was in Spokane.
Washington, close to Canada. And let's see, was anything else here? Let me see. School of Music. Music School of Delaware. Okay. And several also, he's also presented around the state as well and other local associations for his mindfulness. But today we have concept preparation, so we welcome Jonathan Flowers.
Does anyone else need a handout? Well, here, maybe. It'll take a minute. Well, it's great to see everyone. I'm just recovering from an illness, so I'm not trying to imitate a flight attendant. I just want to make sure you can hear me in case I go hoarse. So thank you for flying with us. Oh boy. Let's see if we get this here. Okay. Hopefully you can hear me pretty good. Excellent. So, today I hope to cover some things that are relevant to the elementary, beginning, and intermediate levels. I want to talk about how do we get our students ready to learn the things they need to know in their repertoire. So I want to start with a situation. Imagine you have this situation. I'm not sure how well we can see the slides, but let me tell you about a story that happened to me years ago at the beginning of my teaching career. I had a wonderful student, and I had neglected to plan for something for their lesson. So, on a page of their lesson book, it introduced dotted quarter notes, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, I had forgotten to get the student ready. So, I went to that page. You can go to the next slide. And there it is. It defines dotted quarter notes. So we went over them, and we tapped the rhythm, and we counted them. And then we just went right ahead into a little piece that uses the dotted quarter notes. So you can go to the next slide. There you go. So then the next week the student came in and they played it something like this. Now, this was not the student's fault, it was really my fault. Textbooks do a good job presenting information, but it's the teacher's job to prepare the student for that information. It's not enough to turn the page, explain something, and then say, let's go. If we're doing our job as teachers, we should be using the sources that we're choosing intelligently. So what my job was is that weeks before, I should have been preparing this student to understand this concept first orally and then later through notation. So if you can go to the next slide, this little lesson kind of taught me two things. Telling is not teaching. It's not enough. If we say to a student, why didn't you count that river right? I explained it to you, da 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 da. Telling is not teaching. The other thing is a Latin phrase. So this Jewish man's going to give you one of his favorite Latin phrases. Repetitio est mater studiorum. Repetition is the mother of learning. We need to create experiences for our students to work with a concept numerous times so that when they're ready to go home and practice, we know that they independently can correct themselves, monitor themselves, and bring themselves to success. And that's what concept preparation is all about. Sorry about that. Next slide. So I want to acknowledge a couple catalysts for this presentation. A lot of the basic theoretical foundations of this topic I've gotten from a course I took from the Francis Clark Center, Foundational Pedagogy. And as we see, concept preparation is a big touchstone in the teachings of Francis Clark. The other person I want to acknowledge is in this room, Joan Fasulo. I recommend you go to our MTA blog. She did a post, Developing Rhythmic Security with Elementary Students. That's concept preparation. So it's an excellent article. I recommend that all of you read it. And Joan talks about the things she does to get her students ready to deal with a particular rhythm pattern.
Jonathan, is that on our website, MLMT?
Yes, it is. It's on our, it's one of our more recent blogs. I'm sorry that this thing is squeaking. Okay. And the third desire that I came up with is just a way of, I wanted to come up with concepts that I teach to different students, and I teach all ages from young, and I also have a significant number of adults, and I wanted to have some touchdown concepts that everybody needs to learn, and I wanted to have very well prepared ways of teaching them that I could adapt to every student's needs, and have materials at hand that I could use, write in a lesson, and teach very efficiently. So these are the things that inspired this study. So next slide. So what is concept preparation? Well, to begin, let's just talk about how I'm going to use the word concept in this presentation. Sorry, I won't do that. I won't do that. Okay. When I talk about a concept, would you mind taking this? When I talk about a concept, I mean any kind of an element of our curriculum that can pertain to elements of music. So we can have concepts of rhythm, such as tempo, meter, notes and rests, and patterns. We can have concepts of pitch, staff reading, intervals, scales, chords, harmony, among other things. The next category I call sound production. We could also call it technique. I view technique is at its base, it's producing sound. So things like teaching students how to play with good tone quality at every dynamic level. Articulation, balance within chords, balance among parts, voicing chords, pedaling. Any physical processes that are involved in producing the sound that we intend to produce. Another category could be musical structure and style. This could be talking about forms of music, sonata forms, sonatina forms, sectional forms, phrase and period design, motive development, genres, stylistic performance practices, music history. I'm going to concentrate my discussion on the first three of these: pitch, rhythm, and sound production. Next slide. So Francis Clark, in her teaching, and I have a book that she's written that I can show to you where this comes from. She identifies 3 stages in teaching a concept. The first is preparation, and this involves giving the student a chance to hear the concept, to feel it by playing it or singing it or moving or tapping, then introducing the symbol as in a notational symbol, and then naming it. It's very important that naming comes last, and we'll see why that's important in a minute. The next part is presentation. Presentation is what books like method books are meant to do. So what we saw in the very beginning where it explains how to count a dotted quarter note, there is nothing wrong with that page. In fact, it's quite good. The problem is that's not the way we want our students to learn things. We want the presentation to be a summary of what they've already internalized. The third part she identifies is follow-through. These are activities that the teacher curates to help the student reinforce and practice the concept. So this can include things like written work, keyboard drills and activities, improvisation, composition, and most importantly, encountering the concept week after week in their assigned repertoire. Another way of doing this is giving the student a yo-yo piece. I want to thank Marvin Blickenstaff for that acronym. You're on your own. When a student has been working with a concept, give them a piece with minimal guidance and say, I want you to go home and play this for me next week. And if they can practice it independently with not too much guidance from me, I feel safe that that concept is going to stick in their memory. So, next slide, slide 9. Concept preparation then refers to the activities that a teacher creates to enable the student to experience a concept in a meaningful and memorable way before the student is expected to practice the concept independently in their assigned repertoire. So when a student ignores or incorrectly performs a concept in the repertoire, an articulation marking, a rhythm, the source of the problem frequently stems from inadequate preparation of the concept. So when a student is ignoring something that I've taught, I mean, there are many things. We can say, well, did you practice? Obviously, that's part of it, but we should know that before we give a student something to practice, we should know that they're ready to practice it. Slide 10. So I want to talk about experiential learning and textbook learning and how it relates to concept preparation. Let's take an example, experiential learning. Let's talk about a child learning to speak the word chair versus an older student learning the word chair in a Spanish class. I'll call that textbook learning, okay? So for a child learning to speak, his or her experience might go something like this. They hear the word chair. Then they repeat the word chair, and they get to feel what it feels like in their mouth to produce the word chair. Then eventually they learn a symbol of the chair. It's that thing over there, okay? Then, many years later, they learn to read and write the name of chair as C-H-A-I-R. Children often know many hundreds of words how to speak orally and to speak before they learn to read a single word. Let's compare this to what I call textbook learning, the way things can easily be taught if we're not on top of our game as a teacher. Let's say a student's in a Spanish class. They reads the word silla for Spanish in chair. Then they learn so they read it first, they name it first. The symbol, the student learns to associate silla with the English word chair, and then they get the symbol. Then, through hearing, the student may or may not hear the word in a conversation about a chair, if the teacher is speaking enough Spanish in class, if. Feeling, the student learns to refine their pronunciation of the word, or not, through interaction with the teacher and speaking the word silla. So do you see those two processes are kind of reversed? When we learn language, we go from hearing to feeling the word in our mouth, to learning a symbol, what the word represents, and then later we learn to name it and read it. Often when we learn things from textbooks or in school because of the pressure of time or whatever, we read it first, then we get the symbol, then maybe we listen to it and hear it a little more, and then we're lucky if we learn to pronounce it correctly. So they're kind of inverted. So the process that we're going to talk about in concept preparation goes more towards the experiential learning. It's trying to restore learning to the way we actually learn things in our common experience. Slide 11. So the thing to get here then is teachers provide the preparation of the concept so that when they get to it in whatever materials you're using, be it an anthology or a method book, those books provide the presentation of the concept. So we don't want to wait till the thing appears and expect them to practice it. We want to make sure that they've internalized this. So, slide 12. How do we plan for concept preparation? How do we put it in our teaching? Okay, slide 13. The first step is to create a learning sequence of concepts and materials. So decide, for example, I'm not sure how well you can, well, there it is. There's a hypothetical listing of concepts for teaching a very beginning pianist, okay? You might have yours a little different than mine, that's fine. But the point is they're divided into some kind of category and they're put into some kind of order that they need to be introduced that's logical, where one concept builds on the other. And it's important for you to decide this. Don't just go slavishly by whatever materials you're using. You want to decide as a teacher, what do I think is the best way to present these concepts to this student? Step 2, you want to map those concepts to the material and the repertoire that you are using, okay? So for example, on slide 14, here's a map I made for the Faber adult method, which I use along with other things. And I want to be aware of where are these concepts that I've defined as important to my students appearing in the book. Now that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to use everything in the book or I'm going to necessarily go in perfect order. But I need to know that when the student gets to 14 and they're dealing with whole and half and quarter notes, I have to teach that stuff before I open that page, if I decide to use it, of course. So the point is we want to work backwards for where we want to introduce things in our curriculum and plan before. Slide 15. So the next step is to create lessons to prepare each concept before the students use it in their repertoire. So when you're creating a concept preparation lesson, which often will take more than one lesson time, you want to start with hearing. Choose some listening examples, play something for the student, either live or a recording, or maybe even if it's rhythms, you can do spoken word patterns. Let them listen to something. Provide guided questions to get them to describe what they're hearing. The next part is feeling, kinesthetic, getting this concept in their mind and body. Have the student execute the concept through some kind of rote means. If you're doing rhythm patterns, speaking or chanting and chanting back. If you're playing something, have them play it back for you. Then ask the student to kind of describe, what does that feel like in your body? What's moving? You know, use a word. The answer doesn't matter. It's important for the student to come up with their own awareness of what this feels like. This is psychologists call this concept original awareness. A good way to remember a name or a concept is at the time you learn it, to make some kind of personal reaction that's going to help you know what it feels like to encounter that concept. The third part is the symbol. After the student can recognize and hear it and speak it or play it back, and they can know what it feels like to produce it, then we introduce the symbol. So for example, if we're demonstrating staccato and we show them that and they say, oh, it sounds like raindrops. And they say, okay, when you see this dot over the note, it's like a raindrop, isn't it? That's staccato. Then the last thing we do is name it. So first we talk about the symbol and then we name it. Think of a creative way to reveal the concept. Drum roll, please. This will help them to remember it. Make the revelation of the name the last thing you do and make it climactic. Slide 16. The next step is to create a schedule for yourself. How far in advance do I need to start working with this topic before it comes up in my students' practice material? So you have to estimate the amount of time that you need. Now, every student is different age levels are different, and also the levels of student have a way to do it. I can give you some general guidelines, but I'm going to say that it's going to differ from each student, and that's the art of teaching. So for example, a new rhythm pattern, depending on the complexity and the level of student, I want the student to be working on that with me from anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks before it comes in their repertoire. If it's a pitch concept, you're introducing scales or chords or intervals, I would say a minimum of 2 to 4 weeks before I start teaching. I get them working on it with me. Technique and sound production depends. If it's something that's very simply explained, it might only need to be 1 week before the piece. If it's more complicated, it could be a month or 2 months. In general, I will say my technical methods, if I'm using a method book and the student is in lesson 2A, they have learned all of the technique they need to play those pieces while they were in level 1B. And when they're in 2A, their technique is preparing them for what's in level 2B. Next thing is to divide, however you're going to teach this concept, into very small little chunks, preferably which you can space out over multiple sessions. Or for a fast learner or a more mature student, maybe you can sometimes combine 2 chunks into one session that perhaps you separated out for another student. How do you do concept preparation? What I try to do is I just use a 5-minute rule. I try to reserve 5 minutes in a lesson, preferably for some kind of off-bench activity, to work on this concept. Whatever concept it is that I feel that's coming up. Slide 17. So the next step is when you create all of these materials and plans, put them in a notebook. You can organize this a number of different ways. You could have a notebook organized by category, so you could put all of your rhythm plans in one book and maybe your pitch concepts and your sound production or technique. Or you might want to organize it by level. If you have very discrete levels in your curriculum, put all of maybe make a separate book for each level. Another thing you can do is within each level, instead of dividing it by category, just put the techniques in the exact order that you feel they need to be taught to give the student memorable learning. Use whatever works for your style of teaching and your students. Slide 18. So let's see how this works. I want to talk about 3 types of concepts that we can prepare. I want to talk about rhythm, I want to talk about pitch, and I want to talk about sound production. So let's start with some rhythms. Teaching rhythms, and again, if you can read Joan's article, you'll see how well this works. Concept preparation works particularly well for teaching rhythm. So I'm going to share with you a few ways that I've been preparing concepts. You do not need to do what I do, but I hope that you can use some of the ideas that I'm doing to maybe help you either confirm what you're doing or make some changes, or maybe you find a solution that's an improvement on mine, and if you do, please let me know. So let's start with slide 19. Let's start with introducing eighth notes and pairs. So one thing I always do, and this is a step that I've learned, I used to take it for granted, but I don't anymore. When I'm putting together a lesson plan, I write down and I make sure what other concepts does the student need to have an idea of before they learn this concept. So before I introduce eighth note, now I like to introduce eighth notes very early in study. A lot of method books don't introduce them until maybe the 2nd or 3rd book. I understand why for reading pieces, but I actually want my students to have a sense of what eighth notes are right from the beginning. Kodai teachers in teaching vocal music, they introduce quarter and eighth notes before they introduce anything else. There's a good reason for this. When the student learns to feel not only that there's a beat, but it can be divided, it helps the students to really sustain slow tempos and not rush fast tempos. So just having an awareness that the beat divides, that the foot goes both up and down, getting that sense early is good. Another reason why it's good to use eighth notes is a lot of good pieces for rote teaching, such as folk songs, use eighth notes. So we're not necessarily going to have them sight reading the eighth notes right away, but they're going to be aware of what it means to have two notes that fit inside a beat. Then also the other thing is I find that by introducing the eighth notes early, by the time they are sight reading them or playing them in written repertoire, it's not such a big deal to them. So again, so the prerequisites that I want to make sure that they do know, they do need to understand a pulse versus a steady beat. They need to understand tempo, that the same piece can be done at different speeds, but the proportions just change. They should have a basic understanding that music can be divided into slices like a pizza. Some of them have 3 beats, some of them have 4 beats. Later they'll learn that it's way more interesting than that, but that's a start. Okay, so here's kind of a way I might do this. So let's see. I'm just going to have a volunteer. Elaine, pick one of the following 3 fruits: a pear, a grape, or a fig. Pear, okay. Okay, Miriam. Whoa, sorry. That's just going to happen sometimes. All right. Do you like apples, oranges, or lemons?
Lemons.
Lemons, okay. When life gives you lemons, you know the rest. All right, so let's see. I'll just do this with you. And by the way, this works with young students. It also works with adults. You can use other words, but I mean, so what I'll do is I'm going to set a metronome that divides the beat into eighth notes. They don't know what eighth notes are yet? Can you hear that? Okay, so just repeat after me. Pear, 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 pear.
Pear, 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 pear.
Pear, 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 lemon.
Pear, 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 lemon.
Pear, lemon, pear, pear.
Pear, lemon, pear, pear.
Lemon, pear, pear, lemon.
Lemon, pear, pear, lemon.
Ad infinitum, right? Okay. Then we can move to putting out these silly little cards I made, and I'll put them out on a music. But before I do that, let's talk about that. So then after they do this, I'm going to say, I want you to do it again, and I want you to tap your foot. And while the student taps their foot, I'm going like this. Okay? So lemon has 2 sounds in it, lem and un. Where does the un happen? Okay? So we're going to call the touchdown, we're going to call that the beat, and when your foot is up in the air, we're going to call that the upbeat. So notice the lemon fits inside there. Okay? So then I ask them to tap that and feel the lemon. Okay? Now, if it's a very young student, what I might do is I'll give them a few of these cards, and I'll say, or I'll give them another list of things, and I'm going to say, next week, I want you to lead the call and response with me, and they're going to improvise patterns. Okay? Now, obviously, for an older student, I don't need to bring that to a second week. I can keep going. So, the next step after they're really comfortable with the words is I'm going to say, okay, let's replace these with syllables. Now, everyone is different. I don't teach metric counting right off. I teach rhythm syllables first, and then once the students can do rhythms that are pretty straightforward, as soon as I start, before I introduce ties is when I bring in metric counting. So for me, that corresponds when they finish their first method book of reading, I start working on counting. I'm not going to discuss how I teach that today, but I find that syllables are just a little bit easier to get going. And if any of you have ever taught sight singing to singers, you'll know that syllables enable you to get them going very fast. So I use syllables that are a little bit different than Kodai. I use syllables that are called takadimi. If you want to ask me why, I'll tell you a different reason, but they're a little more systematic. In Kodai syllables, the eighth notes are TT, which is fine. In Takadimi, it's ta-di. So the D, the upbeat is different than the ta, and everything is very systematic. So so there's different ways we can get them used to the syllables. I can just have them echo syllables. Ta, 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 di, ta, etc. Okay? Then I can call out fruits and you speak it back in syllables. So lemon, lemon, pear, pear. Now do it in syllables. Okay? So that's called that's called syllable echo, okay? So in a sense, they're doing dictation without writing it down, right? Okay? So after they're very comfortable with that, I'll replace the syllables with the characters, okay? And I'll say, this is ta, and it's, and this is ta-di. And then eventually I'll also show them that the toddies, there can be two couples, and they can all hold hands and be four of them, okay? So they'll see that. So they're reading those on syllables. Then after they're comfortable with that, and I said, well, we've given these syllables, but we haven't given them a name. So then we talk about, how many quarters are in a dollar? So we use 4 as the standard. I don't know why that's the standard, but it's as good as any, so let's leave it there. And then let's see. So if there's 4 quarter notes, and I use a board that has a heart with beats, and then I put 2, how many eighth notes in there? And so we'll call them eighth notes. So then, by this time, they're sight reading these rhythms. Now, I'm not necessarily going to have them sight read things, but I use a lot of rote pieces for my young students. I think some of the Piano Safari things are wonderful, and some of the opening pieces use eighth notes. After the student learns it by rote, I will show them the score so that they start to see it. Okay? For adults, I kind of use some of my own materials, and a lot of folk songs have eighth notes. I teach a lot of adult beginners, and I do begin with rote teaching to get them started. Having the eighth notes in place right away does so much for their rhythmic sense. Now, very often, I won't really assign students with reading eighth note pieces for quite a while. That's okay, but when they get to it, it's not really a big event because they've been prepared. So then the presentation will eventually be, I'll give students small little rhythms to sight read, to tap and count with syllables. And again, they'll start with syllables, so they don't have to worry about, is this beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4. That comes later. In my teaching, there are pros and cons to that, I understand. You do what works for you. Then once I'm confident that they can sight read a 4-bar rhythm well, I'll give them some little pentascale melodies to read with eighth notes. The Piano Safari sight reading cards or the sight reading book for older beginners, they're both great. They're very progressive in terms of going from simple to more complex. I'll use those, or I'll make up my own. And then the follow-through happens after I know that I can put a rhythm in front of them and they can play it or tap it correctly, then they're ready to start playing pieces that they go home and practice that have eighth notes. Okay? Let's talk about another one. Probably one of the most discussed rhythm patterns in all of pedagogy, the dotted quarter note. That's page 22. There are so many different ways to teach it. I don't know if mine is as good as all of them, but I've been using this and it seems to be serving well. I don't really have a problem with my students forgetting how to play this rhythm now. So let's talk about this. So the prerequisite, obviously, they should know all of their notes and rests from whole to eighth note in simple meters. By simple meters, I mean 2, 4, 3, 4, 4, 4. They should know ties very well, okay? And it also helps if they have skills in reading major and minor pentascale melodies, because the materials I use come from that. Okay, so slide 23. My presentation here, I've kind of taken what I've seen other people do and kind of just tweaked it a little bit to make it my own. I think the person I want to most footnote here is Craig Sale. He does a lot of videos on the Francis Clark website. I've kind of taken what he did and just kind of rounded out in a way that works for the way I want to teach. So again, I'm going to start with call and response. So I'm going to say I start with using the names of the 50 states. Okay? So I'm going to chant a rhythm, and I want you to chant it back to me. And again, I'll use my trusty metronome that ticks 8 notes. Can you hear that? Okay. Mississippi.
Mississippi,
Mississippi.
Mississippi,
California.
California,
California.
California,
Etc. And then I'll ask the student, okay, so these states all have 4 syllables, right? So we did it 2 different ways. So there's 4 syllables in each note. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Say that again. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I do whatever I can to get them to tell me the second one seems a little bit late. Okay? Let's tap our foot by it. Feeling. Okay, so which beat does it happen between? And they'll say it happens after 2 and before 3, right? So there's no notation, there's no name, there's no counting. They're feeling okay. And if I have to slow down the tempo, I want them to feel that that second one is up in the air. Okay? Then, slide 24, I'll give them a little assignment. I'll tell them I want you to go home, think of 4 other state names that have 4 syllables. If you need to, Google the 50 states. And then I want you to be able to do them they know that the first one is quarter notes. I want you to be able to lead a call and response where you do them as the straight rhythm and then as the funky rhythm we just did. And to help them remember that, I'll give them an assignment sheet that has the 4 columns, and they'll see that the second one is late because I want them to remember what it sounds like. So then they'll lead that. For an older student, I can probably just do this right within the first lesson. Okay? So the next week we do this, the next 5-minute off bench time, the student will lead the call and response and chanting. Then I might rote teach them a tune that uses dotted quarter notes like Deck the Hall or All Through the Night. I would just play it and have them play it back. Okay? And then I'll say where, and I'll have them sing it, and I'll say what rhythms, what words have the funky rhythm? Deck the hall, oh, it's deck and the, or all through the night, oh, it's through and the. I just have them do this totally by audiating, okay? Their assignment for next week is I will ask them to play that piece for me again. Or I might put a recording of a piece, tell them what key it's in, saying, I want you to learn this by ear. And it's a short melody, no more than 8 bars, that has this rhythm at least 2 or 3 times. Okay, then they come back, they play their rote pieces, and then we'll do more call and response things. Then we'll do it again, but instead, we do call response. Instead of using the 4 syllable words, I'll use the letters A, B, C, D. A, B, C, D. So there's 4 notes, right? But the second one, they're going to hear this. So then when the metronome is ticking, I'll say, I just want you to count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. They're going to do that aloud while I do the patterns. So, and I'm going to ask them, I'm still doing A, B, C, and D. And then I'm going to say, where does B fall? And they'll say after B2. It's on the and of 2. So they'll get that. We'll continue that. And then we'll switch roles. I'll count while they do patterns. And they're going to be tapping their foot and feeling what it sounds like. Then, on slide 25, I'll introduce the graphic. And this is like what I showed at the beginning, what's in the lesson book. And we talk through this and we explain it. I do the patterns while pointing to the notes, and then we explain the technical knowledge of what a dotted quarter note is, and they have this graphic to put in their notebook. Okay? So then we'll start sight reading a few notated rhythms with this. And then on slide 28, I'm going to give them some rhythmic exercises to take home. Usually, if it's a young student, I'll say, I want you to go home and tap rhythms 1 to 4 for me while counting aloud. And then the next week, they might do the next 4. If it's an older student or a really fast learner, if they're catching on quick, I might give them all 8 at one time. It all depends. You do what's right for the student. You always teach to the student, not to your book. After the then I'll have the student come back and do this, and we'll do them at different tempos. When the student, then I'll do a little test. I might have them do the whole page of exercises through, or I might say this is a good way of developing sight reading skill. I'll say, I want you to do number 1, followed by number 7, followed by number 8. And I'll say, okay, 1, 7, 8. This is a great way. I used to put these on flashcards, and I said, wait, I don't need the flashcards. Having them learn to move their eyes all over the place is great practice for sight reading. After they can confidently perform these rhythms, then I'm ready to start assigning repertoire well, usually I start with sight reading assignments, 4-bar melodies for a week or 2, and then we're ready to work on repertoire. And then I make sure that I give them a couple pieces in a row that have this rhythm. Okay? So those are pretty early level rhythms. Let's talk about one that's more relevant to our intermediate students, okay? The famous 3 versus 2 polyrhythm, okay? Again, many ways of teaching this. I don't know if mine is the best, but so far it seems to be working with me, okay? So obviously, the prerequisite, very important skill, the student needs to be able to perform a melody that goes back and forth between eighth note triplets and pairs and perform those rhythms really well. The triplets don't sound like 2 16th notes followed by an eighth note. They need to go back and forth. The opening of my lesson, I actually review this skill to make sure that it's very, very, very firmly nailed down. They also have to be able to orally recognize triplets within a listening excerpt. If I play a little melody, I'll say, can you tell me where the triplets are, without writing it down. So these are things. And I want to make sure I do this a couple weeks before they do a piece such as the one I'm going to show you that introduces this rhythm. Okay? So this is what I'm going to do before I even introduce this concept. Okay? I'm going to give them a recording of a piece that I'm sure everyone's taught. I'm just going to send them a recording and I'll say, this is in C major. I want you to play this for me by ear. Okay? And I'll have them, and I'll say, I'm going to ask you to play it at several different tempos. Okay? So it's going to be probably 60, 80, and 100 or something like that. Okay? So I say, do not look it up. I want you to learn it by ear. Okay? I don't worry about their fingering. I just want to know, can they play it accurately back to me? Okay? So now, then I'll ask them to play it back. Then I'll say, okay, I want you to just hear it in your head for a second. So what is the rhythm on beat 2? And obviously they're going to say triplet, okay? What types of rhythms occur in measures 3 and 4? Play it in your mind. I'm not going to play it again. Oh, those are eighth notes, okay? So now, again, this is a rhythm, a little bit of a concentration exercise, okay? I want you to hear, I'm going to play the piece again. I want you to either sing it or chant it back using our fruit words. So you'll go, pear, strawberry, apple, 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 straw. So I'm doing dictation without writing it down. This sounds basic, but again, what did I say? Repetition is important for concepts, right? This stuff seems obvious to us, but it's not necessarily obvious to the student. I'm forcing them to think in sound, okay? Then let's do another thing with feel. I learned this in a eurythmics class 30 years ago, and it was so great that I've just always used it, okay? So I do a little, not really conducting, but let's say some hand gestures, okay? So I ask them to sing the melody back. For quarter and eighths, I want you to sing or chant and move your hand like you would move your foot,
up, down, very well defined. When you get to the triplet, I want you to make a circle. So dum, da 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 dum, da 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 dum, bum 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 bum, da 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 dum, da 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 dum, bum 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 bum. Okay? So now, how do the triplets feel differently? And then what I find with the circle gesture is if the student tends to rush their triplets and make it sound like 2/16 or an eighth note, for most of the students I've had, this seems to cure it with really no explanation. So if they do it right, I don't labor over it, I move the heck on, okay? So what they won't know won't hurt them, right? So, but I found that's a very good way. Rhythm is not something that should just be seen, identified, and counted. It needs to be felt in the body. If you have a student who loves to dance, let them get up and do something for you. I had a little girl who did it, and she made me think about triplets differently because she's such a beautiful dancer. But feeling that, okay? And what we're really doing is we're nailing down their ability not only to hear the difference between triplets and eighth notes, but feel it, because you have to be able to think triplets and eighth notes easily when you're playing one against the other, right? Okay? Then I might do something. I might ask the student, go home, I want you to compose a little spoken word piece that uses quarters, eighths, and triplets. I might give them some words. I would say, I don't care how silly it is, it only has to be one sentence long. So they're internalizing. I'm just making sure that they really feel the difference between quarter notes and eighth notes. And I'm trying to do it in a fun way that doesn't take too much lesson time or too much preparation. Okay, now we get into the meat of the matter. We got to start playing this polyrhythm, right? So let's do something like this. I'm going to play repeated eighth notes. Then I'm going to ask the students to play triplets, etc. We're going to do that at the same time. Then we'll switch. Okay? I try to do this pretty slow, no faster than 60 beats per minute. Okay? And we describe how the rhythms feel together. And what I try to get them to see is that they don't line up perfectly. And they say, well, how much do they line up? Well, they seem to line up on the beats, but the other triplets don't, right? Okay? So then what I'll do is I made a track where I play eighth notes, they play the triplets, then they play the triplets, and they do it with each hand. And that's all they do. And I say, I don't want you to spend more than 2 minutes on this. Okay? So I'm doing this. I'm spending very little lesson time on this. I'm just mentioning it, and I'm saying, we're not spending a lot of time on it, but it's really important because you're going to see why soon. And they say, why? And I say, you'll see. You want to build up suspense, right? So, stay tuned next week when, okay? So that's one thing. So what they're doing is by using this track, they're hearing what it's going to sound like later before they're asked to do it, okay? So the next part is slide 34. Now we're going to start combining hands, okay? So I'm going to tap a little rhythm, okay? And I'll be sitting next to them, so maybe you can see me if I do it here, okay? I'm just going to tap this rhythm several times, copy what I do, and when you got it, do it with me.
Could you push your stand down?
Yes, I could do that.
Great.
How's that? Okay, ready? Okay, what meter is that in? 3/4. Okay, good. Now, let's do something. Let's bring back one of our old friends. Let's use strawberry, okay? So now watch how I'm going to tap this. Strawberry, 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 strawberry. Where does the second left-hand note come in? Between what and what? There we go. Okay, good. Now, let's try something. Ready? I want you to tap apple, strawberry, apple, strawberry, apple, strawberry. Keep doing that. Okay, then I'm going to have them combine. We're going to go apple, strawberry, apple. They'll do that a couple times. Okay? this is all with no notation, right? Okay? After they got this in their system, I show them the notation. Okay? Let me, slide 35. Okay? Then I'm going to have them count aloud. So I'm going to say, I want you to just count the top line aloud. So you'll go 1 and 2 and 1. And then we'll discuss. I haven't even gotten into the exact. So I say in letter C, notice that the eighth note, that the second eighth note occurs right between ba and re, the second and third triplet notes. Then I'll get into the nitty-gritty, slide 36. So let's see, if we have 3/4 notes, so in a 3/4 bar, if we count the 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and, there's 6 counts, right? 3 numbers with 3 ands, it makes 6 counts. So we want to find a number that both 3 and 2 can divide into, and 3 times 2 is 6, right? So that means that the second eighth note has to come in, the second quarter note has to come in 2 and then, so what you need to remember then is that the second eighth note happens exactly between those 2 notes, between the 2/3 of the triplet. So now they know exactly where it is. So they have been hearing this and feeling this, and then we do the math, okay? And then we give them the name, and I'd say, so these beats, these are 2 beats, these are 2 rhythms that divide the beat in 2 different ways, and they don't totally coincide. So we call it a polyrhythm, and it's 3.2. So then I'll have them go home and tap these rhythms for me until they're fluent. Then the next time, what I'll do is I will open up Chopin's Prelude in E minor. Right, that one. Okay, and I'll have them open the score, and I'll say, I want you to look through this score. There is one measure where there's a 3 against 2. Can you find it? And then that's on page 37, slide 37, and it turns out it's in bar 18. So the first thing I'll ask them to do is we'll work through just tapping the rhythm of the 2 hands together, and until they are fluent with that. And then I'll say, okay, I want you to go home. And actually what I'll do is I won't give them the whole piece. I'll just give them this one measure printed on a page, and I'll say, I want you to practice this hands alone. I want you to tap it, hands alone, tap it, hands together, play it hands alone, play it hands separately. All you have to do is learn this one measure for me, okay? When they can play this one measure, then I'm ready to assign the rest of the piece. And again, I'm only using no more than 5 minutes of lesson time over maybe 3 or 4 weeks. So I have to plan a month ahead before I introduce this piece. And it's good because there's only one of them. So after they do this piece, I can give them pieces that have more of these things. But then they've seen it, and the trick is you want them to do it confidently, the first piece they play in, because then they don't need to be afraid of it. Okay? So those are some rhythms. Let's move on to a pitch concept. So going to slide number 39, okay? Want to talk about, this is an elementary concept, okay? Introducing tonic and dominant. This is, I try to do this before, pretty early on in the elementary level, before students are playing things like the Rheinagel 24 pieces, Opus 1, or things, or some of the Turk pieces with 2 hands. I try to introduce this so that they understand what the other hand is doing and why it's doing it, okay? So before they do this, the student I will have taught the student how to balance a melody with like a drone fifth accompaniment and how to play the kind of 2 dynamics with 2 hands. So this skill is a skill that I try to develop as soon as they're playing with 2 hands. I try, because of the materials that I use to teach this concept, I make sure that they know at least several of their major and minor pentascales and major and minor triads. Okay? And before I introduce this concept, I make sure that they can play Ode to Joy by ear in 1 or more pentascale keys. Okay? So, How do I do this? I'll start and I'll play the theme, etc. Okay? Now then I'll ask them to play the theme, and then while they play it, I'll go. Okay? Very rudimentary harmonization. Sorry, Beethoven. But it works for our purposes. Okay? So then maybe we'll try it in G major. Okay? Then I'll ask them, I'll say, look at my hand. So which notes are the reason I do it in 2 keys is I want them to generalize that I'm playing the first note of the scale and the 5th note of the scale. And they say, you see those 2 notes there? You can create another part to almost any melody using those 2 pitches, right? At least to a lot of them, right? So then I'll have the student play the bass line. Then I have found right there in the lesson, if I go slowly enough, the student can play them together, okay? Then at home, I'll ask them to play that little harmonization, at least in C and G major, okay? Then in the next lesson, I'm going to expand that. I'd say, well, what if instead of just doing this, we have 2 people in the party now, right? Let's invite 2 more people to the party. Okay, they get what I'm doing. I'll say, oh, that's a chord built on C. That's the first note of the scale. That's a chord built on G. Okay, and then maybe I'll do it in G major if I want to. So they'll do that, and they're moving the chords. Okay, okay, and let me make sure I didn't get off here. Okay, now I'll say, let's make this a little more interesting. Let's spice things up a little bit, okay? When we get to that last G major chord, instead of playing G, B, D, how about if we play G, D, F? How does that sound different? I've gotten different words from kids. Spicier, cloudy, it bites, more color. It doesn't matter. As long as the key is you want to give them an opportunity to develop original awareness. They hear something, they react to it. It's very basic and intuitive to us, but for them it's new. So we have to respect that and give them time to grapple with it. So then they're going to they'll play this, then we'll slowly get them to do, and we're going to save that one for the last one. One. It gives a little spice, right? Always save the kicker to the end, okay? They'll go home and they'll practice that, okay? After the student does it with root position triads, I'm going to introduce a symbol, okay? I'm going to say, let's pick a harder scale like D major. Now, I'll play the right hand, you play the left hand. So what's the first note of the D major? Okay, and then play the chord on it. Okay, now find the 5th note. What's the major chord based on that? Okay, and so I'll have them go for it. And now I'm going to tell them that interval that we did, G to F, they will have already learned that it's a 7th. It's an octave minus 1. So it's an octave minus a whole step. So let's see, an octave minus a whole step. Okay, so they find that. Okay, they'll play that, and we'll just do that 1 hand at a time. If the student is doing really well, I may have them try it 2 hands right there very slowly, but that's not really essential. The idea is that they're understanding where this chord comes from. Then I'll say, we could play this piece in any key, and I don't need to write out the notes. I can just use an abbreviation. I'll put the 1 and the 5, and I'll tell them these are things called Roman numerals. So they look like this. I said, we don't have to memorize them, but just remember I and V. And sometimes what I've done before is I just give them a little write-up about Roman numerals, and I would just give it to them to read at home. If they don't read it, I just go over it in the lesson, but I don't want to spend too much time. Then I say, okay, well, these I and V, they're a little bit cryptic, so let's also give them a name. We're going to call this tonic, okay? A tonic is something that refreshes you. It's a place of rest. It's the home base. dominant is something that's active, right? When you're dominant in a sport, you're active. So this 5 always wants to go back to 1. So we'll call it the dominant, okay? So then they're going to play this piece. I'll stick with C major, and they'll play it with the 3 chords, okay? Now, the next one, let's talk about that. Okay, no one in their good mind is going to play it like this. It sounds awful, right? Too much jumpy, okay? Now, next lesson, I'm going to play the chords as you learned them, but now I'm going to play them a different way. How does the second one sound different? So the first one I did, okay? Second one. And if they need help, I might just play the left hand by itself. So, and then I'll try to get them to say, and if they're not sure, I'll say, well, which one sounds a little bit smoother to you? And they'll invariably pick that. And say, well, why do you think it's smoother? Look at my hand. They say, well, you're jumping around less. Then I said, well, guess what? It sounds smoother, and it's easier to play. So let's go with that one. So then what I'll do is I'll have sticky notes with the notes of the chord, right? So I'll have the C, E, G, and the G, B, D, and the G, B, F. And we'll just stack them differently in vertical ways. And I'll say, so we can rearrange the chords, and then I'll have the 2 chords next to each other stack, and they'll see the C going to B is a lot easier than the C going to G. I don't do this on the staff. I do this with the cards, okay? And so I say, so when we change the order, so I said, so then I'll introduce the name. We're going to call this root position because the root is at the bottom. When the root's not at the bottom, we're going to call that inversion. Okay, I don't really get into first and second inversions yet. I have a different way of introducing that. But the thing is I want them to understand where this comes from. Because if in many lesson books they just say, this is 1, this is 5, 7, this is what, they don't know what that means. And how many times did I have students say, what does that mean? So I want them to understand. It's a 5, it's a chord built on 5, and it has a 7th in it, okay? I don't really, for right now, what I'm trying to do is to get them to play melodies with primary triads so that they're going to develop hand independence later to play accompaniments like Alberti bass or waltz accompaniments. So I don't need to get too technical. So then they practice with these new inversions, okay? And then they practice. Then once they do that, we'll show them, I'll introduce a piece that has, actually probably what I'll do is I'll start with harmonizing pentascales. You know, something like that. Then we'll start introducing a piece that uses it, and then I'll make sure they have several pieces after. And after we do C major, I actually like to, this is something that always bothers me. When I teach pentascales, I teach the minor right after I teach the major because I want them to understand that that tonality is a coin with 2 sides, and I want them to hear that difference right away. So then we'll do something in C minor, then I'll go to G, G minor, and then maybe a few other keys. But I try to get students playing in a number of keys as early as I possibly can. Even when I teach them things by rote and they don't even know what a key is, I'll show them that they can take a piece and move it to somewhere else. I want them to understand that music is a movable system. So those are things that you can do. And then when the reason why this is also good is by hearing that tonic and dominant, when they're playing their pieces, even ones that don't have chords, they are much more adept at picking out wrong notes because they've learned what that sounds like, okay? There are many other pitch things I can do. I'm going to move to what I call sound production. Sound production could be called technique, but it really sometimes integrates a little bit of everything, okay? This is slide 44. Let's talk about balancing a melody and accompaniment. Again, I try to teach this as early as possible, as you know, when the student is ready to play both hands, even if they're just playing rote pieces and not reading a lot yet, I still want them to hear this, okay? So my prerequisites for the way I teach this, I like them to be able to play at least a couple pentascales and play blocked fifths, and that they know how to get the nice domed hand and that their fingers aren't collapsing all over the place. So that's other areas of my technique, which I won't go into here. Okay? So the previous week, I've given them a piece by rote, which I'm sure everybody knows. Okay? We don't know the composer, but it's sometimes known as doodle sack, which means bagpipe, okay? I just have them learn this by rote, okay? So they come back and they play it for me. Then I say, okay, I'm going to play doodle sack 2 ways. The notes and the rhythms will be exactly the same, but they're going to sound a little different. Tell me how they're different. So here's the first one. Okay, here's the second one. Okay, volunteer. How do they sound different? Oh, okay. So then we talk about what the melody is. So like, you go to a concert and you see a singer out front and you see people behind them. The melody is the thing that's in the front of the stage, right? That's the thing that if the song has words, it carries the words. The other stuff is totally important, but the other stuff is like the scenery, right? It's totally important. It sets the mood, it sets the shape of everything, but the thing that carries the message is the melody, right? So like you're watching a movie, the scenery is important. You see a gloomy day and they're saying something serious. The setting is very important. It sets the mood and it makes what the actor is saying more meaningful, right? But the thing we have to see is the thing that's in front, okay? So I'm going to say what this means then I will show them the score and they'll see that it's marked forte, although I'm sure the original had no dynamics because it was written in the 17th century. But I'll say, this is forte. I'll say, well, that's not the whole story, okay? Forte means that in general, this thing needs to be loud. What it really means is that this has to be loud. Okay? This should be dialed down 1 or preferably 2 dynamics lower. So I'm going to play this MP. And on a Steinway like this, MP comes through beautifully, right? So then I'll look at them and they'll say, so you can play 2 or more dynamics at the same time. In fact, a couple years from now, you're going to be playing 3 dynamics at once, like when they're playing chorales. And they'll say, so let's talk about how to do that, okay? So they've already identified orally what's going to have. So what we'll do is we'll play one at a time, and I'll play the left hand and I'll balance them. Then I'll ask them, you play the left hand, you balance me. And then they'll say, okay, so now you hear about how loud it has to be, okay? Then I'm going to say, now you're going to do this. So I'm going to sit them down at the piano, and this is how I do it. Maybe you do it differently. I'm going to take their left hand and say, I want you to float your left hand just a tiny bit, okay? So now let's just put this up here, and I'm sure everyone does this. I want you to barely touch it, okay? Said, I want you to imagine that your left hand is floating and your right hand is sinking. Okay, then we're going to ghost play. I want you to just finger this without playing. Look at your hands. See? One's sinking, one's floating. Then I'll say, now I want you to transfer that to floating. Now, if the student has a trouble doing this, there's an intervention I like to use. I buy a couple of those really big hair scrunchies. I'll have the student slip their arm through one of them. I'll pull that left arm up just a tiny bit. Okay? And then I'll have them, now you do it. I want you to just play the left hand alone, pull up the scrunchie with one hand, just a little bit. And I said it should only be about this much. Okay? And then, so the idea is if they have trouble doing it, you try to help them feel the experience. Okay? So now, when I had to do this with online lessons, it was challenged, so I did it mainly through visual means. Or if it was a young student with a parent, I would have the parent, I would say, okay, if you don't got a hair scruncher, just grab their, okay? And if it was, when it was an adult student, I said, just grab your shirt. And I said, now this is only a tiny bit, right? You only need a little bit of salt to make the stew taste good. Too much and you ruin it, right? So they'll practice this way, okay? Then I'll go into their music and I'll mark the left hand MP. So, and then we talk about the left hand is called, then we're going to, so there's the symbol. So when you see forte, that means your melody should be somewhere near there, and let's say the accompaniment should be 2 levels lower. So every time that I'm going to ask you when you see forte in the 2 NPs, I'm going to ask you to tell me what that means. And for the next month or 2, they're going to mark all their music this way, okay? And then we'll say there's a fancy name for the left hand. It's called the accompaniment or the background, okay? So then what I might do is I might have them play pentascales with drones. And don't ignore the left hand because we get this lower voices, we get the melody too, right? Eventually I'll have them play things like that going on. After they can do that, it gets integrated into their technique. Then I'll have them do a little bit of some sight reading. I want to see that if I put a 4 bars in front of them with this in a lesson, that they can figure it out. Once I see that with me watching that they can play this correctly, I'll start assigning repertoire. So they've had a couple weeks to work with this. And then I don't have to go back and say your left hand is too loud. I've put everything in place. So the cons of this is you have to plan ahead and you have to be patient. But if you do it, the students will do it right from the beginning and you're less likely to need to go back and fix it. Okay? Let's go ahead a little bit. Let's go to the intermediate level. Okay? So at the early stage of the intermediate level, there's a couple repertoire pieces I love to use because they're good music and they just really provide the foundation of what students are going to need to play 19th century repertoire. Okay? So one of those collections I use, and I bet everyone else uses, is the Bergmuller Opus 100. Now, very often I see very young students playing this stuff, and they play it beautifully, but they play it with no pedal. Some of these Bergmuller pieces and a few other pieces I'm going to mention are so good for really teaching students how to pedal discreetly in romantic music where it's called for. So I often will use this repertoire with transfer students who played things much more difficult than this because the notes won't be hard to learn, the pieces are tuneful and they repeat a lot, and it allows them to concentrate on a few elements, okay? So I have a series of these that I use just to teach them how to use pedaling with really good good discretion and how to listen to themselves. So on slide 49, I'm going to introduce what I call touch pedaling, okay? So before they do this, they should be very comfortable with just the standard syncopated pedaling. They will have played all sorts of cadence progressions. Or even, they should be doing that comfortably. They should be doing that in their repertoire pretty comfortably. At least pedaling, let's say, once or no more than twice in a bar, okay? So, do I have this with me? I don't have the music with me. So I'll play, forgive me, I don't have it with me. I'll start with, I'm going to play this excerpt a couple ways, and I haven't taught this in a little while, so I hope I don't forget it. I'm going to play this piece 2 ways. The notes and the rhythms are going to be exactly the same, but they're going to sound different. Okay, and I'll play the rest, okay? And then I'll play it again. Okay, and I'll play it again. And then how do they sound different? So, anyone?
The first way was more echoey.
More echoey and blurry, okay? So which one could you hear the melody more clearly in, would you say? Good, okay? So I'll tell them there are times when just doing the regular old pedaling doesn't work because the melody's moving around too much. So we have to do something a little bit smaller, okay? So then I will play I will ask them to sight read the left-hand chords while I pedal them. Okay? Then I'm going to show them what I did, slide 50. I'm going to give them a little diagram that has the counting. If you can go to the next slide, Felicia, because this will be helpful, number 50. They have numbers up there. So I'll say, this is what first I'll have them do a silent pedal exercise. We're going to count out loud. We're going to go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and, right? And I'll tell them you don't even have to press the pedal on my grand down all the way. You can press it 3/4 the way and lift it 90%, okay? And so when they can do that, I'll have them pedal while I play, okay? So then I'll have them do it. They'll play the left hand and pedal. I won't make them play the right hand because they haven't seen this piece yet, okay? And then I'll say, okay, so what we did, then I'll draw a symbol in their music. I'll draw a little pedal symbol on the last half beat of each measure. And I'll say, let's call this touch pedal. Think of it as we're dabbing a tiny touch of glue to plug a hole, okay? And so then, when they can do that, I'll have them practice just the left hand and the pedal, and I'll ask them to go through the piece and say, so where else could we use a touch of pedal? And they'll basically see that at every chord change, they're going to do it. And I'll have them write in the remaining pedal signs, and I'll say, next week I want you to play the left hand alone, and I'm going to play the right hand. You can practice the right hand by itself, so they're going to practice hands alone for this week. We'll play the piece as a duet, and then at that second lesson, we'll start putting it together, okay? Then, so this is a concept I can introduce pretty quickly. Like a lesson ahead is basically all I need. Then after that, slide 51, I'll make sure I give them several pieces that require this touch of pedaling. So there's 3 that you could use that are on a similar level. The Pastorale in the same Bergmuller set. There are a couple of the Striabog pieces that are good. The Striabog pieces musically aren't quite as interesting, but they're good teaching pieces. And then, you can find other pieces in your repertoire, but making this a discrete skill that sometimes we use a lot of pedal, sometimes we use a little pedal. That's important. And understanding why we need the 2. Okay? So, these are things, slide 53. I've only kind of touched on 3 categories of concepts. These aren't the only kind of concepts we can teach about. Another thing that happens particularly at the intermediate and advanced levels, stylistic performance practices, Baroque ornamentation. This takes concept preparation. Using the pedal with taste in classical versus romantic music. This is something that we should talk about as a discrete skill and teach. Playing keyboard harmony for things like lead sheets, hymns, folk songs. You can start teaching that without notation and then move to the assignments. Another thing that warrants preparation in teaching, tempo rubato, right? You could do it the same way I do it. You could play it twice, ask them to hear what you did, and then talk about it. Maybe have them do it with things that are improvised or not notated first, so that they're not trying to count and read the score and play the right notes. Do something that enables them to just focus on just what you're teaching. Other types of concepts, musical structure, teaching sectional forms. There's all sorts of ways to teach this. ABA form, I use my studio. I'll say, you see, this wall and this wall look alike, but that wall looks different because there's a picture on it, right? So let's call these 2 A and that's B. And then you look at your piece, And then teaching this very early on, because when students are memorizing, they learn to develop musical memory. Now, I don't think every piece a student needs to be memorized, but I think every student should develop their musical memory in some way because it develops the mind and it helps them. The other thing is that memorization and playing by ear go hand in hand. So if we want to really build natural musicians, these are things that we can teach in a very explicit way. Other things about musical structure, Baroque dance forms. Okay, before my students play a minuet, I have a playlist on YouTube I show them dancers dancing a minuet. I show them the concepts. I want them to see that when they're dancing a minuet, the women are wearing these really heavy dresses, and the minuet can't be fast because the people are wearing fancy clothes. And it can't have really big accents in it. But then the gavotte is a little different, and I'll show them, a man wearing the knickers and jumping. So that's different. These are things that you can introduce in advance. And then other things, musical structure. I think a student should understand how an invention is laid out well before they play it, right? So those are things. So slide 54, if you want to read further about this, I have a wonderful book by Francis Clark, which you can leaf through. I highly recommend the course Foundational Piano Pedagogy at the Francis Clark Center. They go to this in depth, and part of the reason I wrote this is one of the assignments was to do some concept preparation, and I just took it a lot further. I just did the self-paced class. I didn't do the one where you can either do a self-paced class or you can just do it on your own. I did on my own. And another thing is an article by Craig Sale in the question and answers section of Piano Magazine. So, I mean, I think the key of doing concept preparation, slide 55, is just kind of remember these 4 things if you take away nothing from this talk. So go from sound to feel to symbol to name, and make the name the climax of the instructional process. Break the learning into small chunks. What might seem small to us is not small to someone who's learning it for the first time. Provide lots of opportunities for the students to visit the concept again and again. And then the 4th one's probably the most important, plan, plan, plan. So, and then I'll just add a 5th thing. It's very important to be students of our students. We have to do what works for them, not necessarily works for us. So just observe your students and try to come up with materials that you can adapt on the fly so that it works for the person that's sitting in front of you. And it doesn't necessarily have to look good, it has to work. So anyway, I'm happy to answer any questions. But, oh, good, we're going to get to lunch on time, okay. Any questions, anything I can answer? Yeah.
Do you find that frequently the method books will cover something very quickly and then run?
Yes.
Yeah. So
That's why we have to supplement.
yeah.
I do use method books, but I try to use them intelligently. That's why I mentioned at the beginning is before I choose a method book, I have my own idea of, first of all, I actually do think of my curriculum as very discrete levels, and I think about what should a student at a given level or playing a given level of repertoire understand and know how to do. So first I work with that, and I try to choose materials that work best with how I feel I can teach. I also realize that I want to allow choices so that if students have particular interests, I can cater to that. But yes, that's true. Just because the method book spends 2 pages on it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you spend little time on it. I agree with that. And again, if the method book introduces it on page 40, you need to be talking about it at page 1. So I found that teaching that way is good, but it takes a little bit of organization. But my end goal in creating this concept preparation notebook is I'm forcing my way to come up with these plans so that I can, in the long run, be more efficient. So, but yeah, you have to decide yourself as a teacher. Don't ever be a slave to what's in your book. Make the book serve the purpose that you want to accomplish. So, and there are a lot of good books out there, but it takes a teacher to make them come alive. I really do believe that. So,
If I could just
yeah.
add to that, just to reinforce it, as somebody who worked directly with Frances Clark for several years, I know that she would go today like this with the beautiful presentation that Jonathan just made. Craig Sale was actually a pedagogy student of mine under her mentorship.
Oh my
And
goodness.
The state thing is actually probably my only one claim to pedagogical fame. Craig was having trouble with the teaching a student the dotted quarter, and so we put our brains together, and I came up with the states, and he's doing
I got that from him.
And
I did.
yes, and run with it, and I'm thrilled for
Yeah.
Greg, is a good friend of mine. But I would just say what's so important about this philosophy is that it goes from what the student knows to what the student does not know. So you begin with concrete things without naming it. And those of us who worked with her, we feel sort of evangelical about it.
Yeah.
Forgive me, but thank you.
Well, thank you. That means a lot to me.
your
But yeah,
excellent presentation.
their site, I mean, and get their journal. Their journal is excellent. Their new website is called Pianos and Spires. I'm going to make the slides available to you. You probably noticed the slides differed a little bit from my handout. I made a few tweaks, but but I highly recommend anything that Frances Clark teaches is valuable, and I'm trying to read more of her things. But this book in particular, I think I've read it more than once. If you want to hold it up, Elaine. Yeah, pass it around. Great book. It's a book that's meant to be highlighted, tabbed, used, loved. She's just, I can tell she was a very no-nonsense lady who really cared about students. And I wish I had met her. So,
Can I just share with you?
yeah.
I don't mean to
Yeah.
dominate this, but
No,
it's just,
go ahead.
it gets my adrenaline pumping because this is underlying my entire philosophy of teaching for the last 4 years was just the blessing of having gone to the new school and worked under such a brilliant, influential person. But when you say telling is not teaching,
Yes.
those of you who are of a certain age will remember when you were children and you went into a bank. What did it look like? Where were the tellers? Just picture that for a minute.
Yeah.
And so Francis would say to us, tellers belong behind bars.
I love that.
You'll never forget.
I love
You'll
that.
never-
I
there's
love
many
that.
things like that when you worked with her.
Wow, that's great. Well, I'll have to pick your brain more about it. I'm actually still working my way through this course. I just felt there were so many ideas that were so rich, I just wanted time to explore them. So I ended up doing a lot of other outside reading, and I said I'm going to take my time with this because it's so valuable. But the other thing I just like to say is one of the things that kind of keeps me going as a teacher is to just never stop learning. And I'm never really satisfied that I'm doing the things the way it ultimately has to be done. And times change and students change, so we always have to be on our game.
Sure.
And that's why organizations like this is so important. So,
Yes.
but great.
Awesome job.
So I will, Felicia, you can take the slides and put them on the website. I think the slides are a little bit better than the handout. And
Do you have any questions on the Zoom there?
No, just thank you, Jonathan, for
thank you,
for your
Zoomers.
thorough and well organized presentation.
Thank you.
How many people were online?
3,
Okay,
4
very nice.
earlier.
Very nice. And thank you to Felicia for flying the plane.
Thank you.
So, thank you. It means, it's great to see all you guys, and thank you for Elaine for allowing me to come this month rather than last. I sounded like Harvey Fierstein a month ago, so it worked out well.
Wonderful.
So,
Awesome. Let's give
Thank you
Jonathan
so
a round
much.
of applause here.
And I will say bye to the people on Zoom. Thank you.
yes, bye-bye. Thank you for coming.
Well, that was great. I mean,